Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. As we start the new year, let's review the recent decades. 1982 gave us the Commodore 64. 1992 gave us Windows 3.1 with Apple's TrueType font support. 2002 gave us the BlackBerry 5810, the first smartphone-ish device. 2012 gave us the Raspberry Pi, which can run that Commodore 64 or Windows 3.1 with an emulator. So 2022, whatever hardware or software innovations or emulations you have in store, make them cool, like Blackberries, Raspberries, or the Commodore. Which means this week we talk with Larry Maccherone about making the concept of shift left a singularly successful transformation rather than two four-letter words. In the news segment, PwnKit reaches root from argv0. A smart contract returns any amounts from a deposit of 0. A different smart contract has a flawed fallback function of 0. Apple awards a Safari bounty of 5 zeros. And more. Read William Gibson's Count Zero and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Imperva protects applications wherever they live and at the pace of development. From securing applications at runtime to protecting APIs in any cloud environment, only Imperva offers a unified solution across edge, application, and data to help you achieve more and save money. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva. This is episode 182, recorded January 31st, 2022. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here back once again with John Kinsella. Hello, John. Good to have you back.
Good to be back. I'm still alive. For those who didn't hear, I got finally caught by the nasty COVID, so that took me out for a bit over a week, but I'm happy to be back.
Happy to have you, and I hope you continue to feel better. For everyone else, if you don't want to miss your favorite Security Weekly content, visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, a Discord server, and chat with us right now, or follow us on our social media and streaming platforms. Then join us February 16th to learn about validation techniques within applications. Then you can join us again on March 2nd to learn 5 things you can do to catch more bad guys. To register for these webcasts, visit securityweekly.com/webcasts. Also, don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Looking at Larry Maccherone's career, you might think he can't figure out what he wants to be when he grows up. Serial entrepreneur, Agile transformation coach, open source developer, data scientist, DevSecOps thought leader. Yet the underlying theme is that he's constantly been striving to create the highest performing software engineering teams, whether in productivity, quality, or security. At Comcast, Larry built and scaled the DevSecOps transformation program over 5 years, and now he's looking to apply what he learned doing that to help all contrast customers and prospects. Hello, Larry. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, Mike, glad to be here. And John, good to see you. I'm glad you're nicely recovered. We're getting on the path to that, at least.
Appreciate
it. We're happy that you've joined us again, Larry, because last time we talked, it was about DevSecOps transformation, and you're back once again about DevSecOps. Possibly about doing things right or learning to make sure it doesn't go awry, I think, is our nice provocative title was alluding to. So maybe help us with that idea of like what should we be worried about, or why should we be worried that just throwing out cliches like shift left and saying that's what we're going to do, this is how we're going to tool ourselves into shift left or something like that isn't necessarily the right path to put people on.
Yeah, when you think about what happened with the Agile movement and the DevOps movements, among other things, the Agile movement shifted the ownership of the quality of the products left to the development team. And the DevOps movement and cloud native movements shifted ownership of the ops of the product left to the development team. Not completely in either case, but this fundamentally disrupted the way it was done before. People whose job it was to test applications that were given to them, and they had 3 weeks to test it, and they threw the findings, the bugs back over the wall of development. That was the pattern before. That's over. Those days are over. Those folks are now on the development team, helping the development team produce quality day one. Same thing with DevOps for ops and cloud native for ops as well. It's now security's time. And the problem, though, is that you can't just take the old way that QA or ops or security did their job and expect the development team to do it the same way and be happy and successful at that. So the whole idea of automation fundamentally changes. Automated testing is written by the developers as they write the code is sort of the best practice for QA now as well. And ops folks are getting, development teams are getting feedback from production on the operations of things. We need to have automation similarly for security, and it needs to be in the hands of the developers, but they're not necessarily ready for that. So we need a gradual way of getting them ready for that, becoming worthy of being trusted with the security of their products.
So one of the aspects of that is that, these are common themes: automation, feedback loops, et cetera. But one of the things maybe we don't necessarily dwell on enough is building up that program from the beginning, and what are the roles, the skills, the personalities that are helpful in terms of getting a program like that off the ground. And by this program, I mean a successful DevOps approach that is actually taking charge and responsibility for security, but are enabled and empowered to do it. They have the right things in place. And that one of those right things needs to be someone that's helping them through, and that someone needs some good skill sets.
So the traditional security group has a lot of folks who are essentially all day long, their job is to call the development teams baby ugly. They're basically looking for problems in somebody else's work. And it's naturally very confrontational. Auditing, policing, gatekeeping are all sort of confrontational roles that security has traditionally filled. So in order to actually get development teams to desire to change and adapt this new approach, you need someone who's less like that. You need someone who's more like a coach. And the coach is a great analogy because the developers are the ones who are producing the product. They're the ones who are writing the vulnerabilities into the product. They're the players on the court playing the game. The coach is on the sidelines. The coach makes most of his impact during the sort of practice sessions, the getting them ready, the workshops, if you will, is the language I tend to use. Coaches host workshops for development teams. And so you need the kind of person who's sort of used to that and likes to work that. My very first hire into this DevSecOps transformation coaching role was two things that I think was really wonderful. One, he was an athletic coach, Olympic boxing coach, and a former. And then two, he was a scrum master. He had no security background when I hired him. We taught him, and the framework we provided him actually provided all of the security details for the development team. But he was specialized in and had the mindset of helping development teams to change the way they operate. And that was the key thing that was missing, is missing from most security folks trying to do the same thing.
That sounds a neat and a really good insight into setting up that two other terms that are common in these conversations of empathy, collaboration. Because you made a comment before of along the lines of can the DevOps be trusted with the security of the applications? A lot of times we don't invert that in the sense of can the AppSec team be trusted with understanding the development requirements and the development needs of the DevOps team. And that's where we get into, unfortunately, some of those antagonistic relationships of calling their baby ugly, as you put it, or just saying, we're going to find the flaw, say, go fix it. This coaching or constructive approach sounds like it's much more successful, but at least in theory. So in practice, what are some of the ways then you point to, or what are some of the metrics you draw on to show that these approaches can actually, in fact, be successful?
Yeah, so I did this over the course of 5 years at Comcast. Very diverse environment, 600 different development teams. I didn't start trying to go thin and wide with 600 different development teams. I started going deep with just a few. 10 development teams were in the program the first for a few months. And I was very aggressive about investing in capturing metrics that showed that the teams that changed to this approach, the ones that joined the program, had much lower security risk in production. After a few years, we were able to show that teams that were in the program had 15%, 1/6, 6.5, 1/6.5, almost 1/7, as many incidents and vulnerabilities in production as the teams that were not in the program. And so with that data, you can convince a lot of folks to sort of invest more and expand the program. And so deep first, very effective for a few development teams, which only covers a portion of your applications, and then use the results of that to gain momentum, to get executive sponsorship, to make other teams want to be on board. Not just because the results are better, but it's actually less painful for the development teams to do it this way than to just constantly being told their baby is ugly. More fun for them, less painful for them to do it this way.
Indeed, less painful. And a lot of this is the idea of building in desirable behaviors. What are the behaviors we would love to see within DevOps practices that just make it so that vulnerabilities are less likely to be introduced? Or I think what you're getting at too, maybe it's easier to fix those vulnerabilities, because I don't think that you mentioned that, having teams 1/6 less, or I'm going to possibly do the math slightly incorrect there as I do the comparison, but teams improved with fewer vulnerabilities in prod. But I don't think we necessarily gamify how many total vulns do you have. The gamification or the desired behavior comes from something else, typically more about speed of fixing. Is that the case that you saw?
Yes. We use the metrics for three purposes. The one I already mentioned was essentially to gain executive sponsorship and get the program rolling. But we also fed it back to the development team so that they could improve. And the speed of resolution was key. But just as we went deep with a small slice of development teams and apps, it's also important to go deep within that development team and just focus on really effective improvement in one metric for a very small sliver of policy. So for instance, we have tools like software composition analysis and SAS, static application security testing, and IaaS, interactive application security testing tools, all integrated into the pipeline. And they're giving you findings: critical, high, medium, low. And if you say, okay, well, let's just put an SLA on the criticals of 30 days and the highs of 90 days and the lows, mediums of 180 days, it's something like that. You get this very wide, spread out, overwhelming effect. What's better, however, is to say, first, let's just focus on the criticals. And let's not just resolve all the backlog of criticals. Let's get the feedback loop so tight that the average critical that comes up in the future is resolved within a day. So we're shooting for less than a day median time to resolve. The median time to resolve in the industry for criticals and highs is up above 100 days. And so that's a dramatic 2 orders of magnitude difference, what we're talking about, but we're only talking about doing it for criticals. Once you get the initial set of criticals resolved and you turn on merge blocking for any new code that has a new critical, then they get into a habit of resolving these within a day, the day that they're written, essentially, or the day that the new vulnerability comes out. Then you expand the scope to highs, and you do the same thing. You burn down the initial set of high findings, and then you flip on the merge blocker so that you never have a new high finding get into production ever again. And in this way, you get this gradual improvement ramp that happens over time. And we can actually show this in charts, and we use the charts to actually coach the development teams to this behavior.
Yeah, I think, and one of those things is that you're starting to build towards something I think broader than just managing to a metric. And I know that's not what you were saying immediately, and but I'm sort of saying that from the perspective of one of those cautions of don't do that in terms of just manage to a specific metric, in the sense that get all the criticals down, then get all the highs down. Then imagine you're done, and then 6 months later, those criticals start to creep in, because even if you have merge blockers, uh, tools are imperfect. Security tools are imperfect, and bugs reach into production. But I think where I'm going with this is it sounds more of setting up a culture, and that's similar to what Agile was, setting up a culture of quick iterations. For example, security here, we're talking about security perhaps as a component of quality of the software. How do you iterate quickly? So how did you approach setting a culture, setting up those practices or behaviors so that they would be they would persist far beyond just, great, this quarter we fixed all of our criticals, this quarter we fixed all of our highs, now the rest of the year we can coast, and we're just going to go back to fixing our, creating our features?
Right. So we needed to create a gradual on-ramp for improvement. So we defined practices, a set of practices that we want every development team eventually to do. And some of these were not security practices. They were basic, good software engineering practices. For instance, like having an automated integration test suite run in the pipeline before the merge request gets a code reviewer on it, which is not that common today even, but it's getting more and more common as we go on. We made that essentially one of the first practices. Another practice, so to speak, is to get every member of the development team trained in secure coding. And so what we did is we grouped these practices into the primary six, the six key ones we want everyone to work on first because they have the best bang for the buck. And then we had the secondary six that were sort of the next round of that. And then we had the rest. The table in the end had about 40 practices in it. And nobody ever got to the full cultural level for that. By the way, that's the maturity model we have: thoughts to words to actions to culture. And I can drill into that a little bit, but let me describe first how we use this. So we sit down with the development team, the coach, in a workshop. Takes 90 minutes to do the initial workshop. The developers are in the room, but so are the product people, the people who could make a decision to say, we're not going to change a lot. We're not going to do a lot of work to change our processes in the next 90 days because we have a lot of features to get out. But we want those folks in the room for the initial workshop. And we start doing a partial gap analysis using the initial six, the primary six. As soon as we find 2 or 3 practices that the team is not at culture for, meaning they're getting full value out of the use of that practice, then we immediately switch out of gap analysis mode and we switch into planning mode. Well, what would it take to actually implement this? What would it take to get everyone through secure coding training? What would it take to put on a software composition analysis tool in your pipeline and get the feedback immediately at the pull request level so you could turn on blocking? Well, we're currently on Jenkins and we're moving to GitHub Actions. So we really want to do that for the apps that we've already moved or we're about to move. So this is the kind of planning that you do. And this changes the nature of the relationship between the coach, the security representative in the room, and the development team. The coach is really there to facilitate a conversation around the team making plans and making their own commitments. At the end of the 90-minute session, we go around the room, starting with the product people. We say, do you support this plan? Which means you'll do everything in your power to make sure that the development team achieves the goals they set for themselves during the workshop. And often the product people will say, no, it's too much to do in the next 90 days. Let's cut that back from 3 practices to culture to 2 practices to culture. And that's how we get the buy-in, and that's how we get it to happen. Using this approach, 93% of the time when teams make a commitment to turn something one shade of green darker from either thoughts, words to actions or actions to culture, in the next 90 days, they achieve that using this approach. And often, if you just sort of said, make a plan, get an exception, we'll come back to you in 90 days, nothing will have happened traditionally. With this coaching approach, you're much more likely to get them to actually make this change.
Yeah, I think, and there's quite a bit, just saying here are the top 6 things, that can be overwhelming because you're hitting on a bunch of things from tools to secure coding to training, things like that. So one of the questions maybe, and we've got a question from listeners in the sense of when you're doing these 6 practices, let's say secure coding is one of them, how much are you just focusing on coding practices, or have you mentioned you have some metrics, maybe that would help us illuminate this, of just focusing on coding and having feedback loops about vulns versus diving into secure coding and in-depth classes on whatever's language specific to handling your memory unsafe languages, your buffers, etc., to just logic flaws that might come up in your Go's, Rusts, or your JavaScripts, things like that.
Yeah. So interesting thing about training is we had sort of several levels of training that we offered, and we expected every developer to go through a 2 to 3 hour secure coding class, in online interactive wargaming style, developer against machine, where you do an attack and it's fun, and then you have to sort of change the code so that it prevents the attack. And so this had very high net promoter score for a class that we offered. Developers loved it. They got their friends to do it, and it was highly effective. We could correlate teams that had everyone on the team through secure coding training versus teams that didn't, had somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% fewer vulnerabilities in production than teams that didn't. The other levels of training, interestingly enough, were not effective. So the next higher level, we expected every team to have one person from the group go through that training. We actually correlated the teams that actually had a green belt. This was the higher level. The yellow belt was sort of the initial level. Folks that went through green belt had one member of their team go through green belt, actually had worse security risk outcomes. And so we found that the program is 40 hours of training, and we found that the program had a self-selection bias. We went and asked the folks, well, why did you send Joe to this to be your green belt and security green belt? And they would say, well, Joe isn't a very good programmer, so we figured we could live without him for a while. So that's not the likely person to sort of be effective. So the thing about training is that it isn't always effective, but the meta message here is you have to measure the effectiveness in order to know what's effective. You can think you're doing good things, and you're really just wasting money. And so that's how we used to decide what the key 6 things was this very quantitative feedback mechanism on the program itself, on the list of practices itself, as well as the feedback to the development team. And that was largely focused on the adoption of the practices first, and then second, the metrics from finding resolution. And I have charts that show the difference between a healthy team's findings curve and a non-healthy team's finding curves that would help to pull those up and show those.
Yeah, let's bring those up. And for our listeners who are just audio, we'll share them. We'll figure out how to make sure that we share this in the show notes so you can peek at them later. And while you're bringing those up, Larry, what you were just saying there at the end, I think really reinforces the aspect of the benefits of the coaching approach, because you were talking about quantitative metrics, demonstrating feedback, measuring change. And we are talking about coding, programming, technical topics. But the coach, and in general, we're talking a lot about human behavior. And if we're setting up training as the punishment, meaning that you have the worst scores, therefore you have to go to training, that's kind of setting up punishment. Or in your example too, if so-and-so isn't a great coder, we're going to send them to training, which may be necessary, but that's not to help with their skills. But from a security perspective, that's not necessarily going to be a win. And I can also imagine there's that dynamic of diffusion of responsibility. If it's saying that, hey, DevOps team, you're going to be in charge of security now, but we're only going to train your one person on security, and they're going to be your go-to person, everybody can just say, well, so-and-so is now the one in charge of security, rather than everybody. So I just wanted to highlight that as those aspects of behavioral and human behavior to pay attention to, rather than just think that we can only ever deal with code. We're dealing with programmers, people. And now we're going to hopefully deal with some visuals. What have you got for us, Larry?
Yeah, so just responding to that first, though, I mean, the whole program is designed around developer psychology and development team sociology, and to leverage those things rather than fight against them. And so that's essentially the way the whole framework is designed. And these charts are a key part of the framework. So these are cumulative flow diagrams. So most security folks have never seen a cumulative flow diagram, but most developers have. It's a very common visualization of how work gets done. Basically, work moves through various states. It's in planning. It's in a sprint. It gets completed in the sprint, and then it gets accepted in the sprint, et cetera. And so it moves through these states. And you can map these states as different bands on a stacked area chart, which is how cumulative flow diagrams are built. And you just about everything about that team's work can be analyzed with a cumulative flow diagram once you know what it's doing. And so what's going on here is that this orange line represents new findings that are coming into the system. These are vulnerabilities that are being found by a scanning tool. And we could filter down to just highs and criticals is what the filter is set to here. And you can see that the team is finding more stuff, and maybe they onboarded another app in this time frame, and that's where there was a cliff. And you can also see that they're resolving things, because that's what this green line represents, that it's coming up, it's going up. And then this blue area is false positives, essentially. But if you notice, the gap between this line and this line is not really getting smaller. It's essentially the same or slightly larger than it was here, and it was much larger here. And the only reason it got down to roughly the same size as back here is because they marked a bunch of things as false positives. And so we would use this chart. We would be looking at it without the team in the room on our own, essentially. And we had sort of flags set to, if there was a spike in false positives, we would always look at it that day that with the tooling found a spike. And then we would go have a conversation with the team. And it turns out that the team was really just got worried that this gap had gotten large. There was a coaching session around this time frame after the gap had gotten large, because that triggered a coaching session. And they marked a bunch of things false positive just to get them off their plate, which is not a very healthy practice. You look over here, and this is a difference in a healthy team. So this orange band is still alive today and looks like it'll continue forever. Look over here. The team onboarded their apps, and they kept finding stuff. They onboarded maybe another app here. But at some point here, they realized that they had enough information to start whittling it down. And this was the result of one sprint's worth of work to resolve a bunch of findings. And then they got into more of a pattern of continuously resolving the findings through this time frame here. In this time frame, we noticed the spike in the false positives, and we set up a coaching session with the team. It turns out that these were true false positives. The team wasn't just trying to get them off their back, but the tool was actually reporting something wrong. It didn't sense a particular sanitizer correctly. And so we reconfigured the tool, and that's actually where this spike came from in this time frame, is that it doesn't show them as false positives because the later scan they're missing, and that then shows up as resolved. The other nice thing to notice here is that a couple other things to notice here is that the basically get clean and stay clean. The other thing to notice here, the second thing, nice thing to notice here, is that the findings curve is pretty much leveled off to near zero, meaning that the learning that occurred while they went through this initial set of resolving a bunch of things stuck, and they're not injecting new vulnerabilities. This is actually a very powerful effect, much more powerful than the find and fix effect, maybe 100 times more powerful in my estimation. That once you get this really tight feedback loop, the learning is so deep that developers rarely make the same mistake again. And they will rapidly fix them in other parts of the code base when they come up.
Yeah, and so what we're seeing, and especially too for our audio listeners, is that we have a gap between the total number of vulnerabilities being found and unfortunately wider gaps for them being fixed. But over time, in those healthy programs that you're describing, Larry, that gap It closes and closes until there's pretty much an indistinguishable hairline distinction between a vuln open and a vuln closed. One of the things that stands out here, though, is that it looks like there's at least a 6-month time frame in terms of initially collecting these metrics and then getting some actual change to start to see that the slope, the rate of closing start to actually diminish that gap between open vulnerabilities. And then it's not until, 8 months or maybe even a full year that it takes for a team to get to that healthier spot where vuln is identified, vuln is fixed, vuln is identified, vuln is fixed, and the gap there is as small as possible. So I'm kind of curious, is that kind of time frame, 6 months, 8 months, a year, pretty reasonable? Are there, what are some expectations to help set for teams so they don't get discouraged about making this type of transformation?
Yeah, I mean, the whole program with 12 key practices, 6 in the first round and 6 in the second round, where software composition analysis findings are in that first round. The whole program takes about 1.5 years of a team getting to culture on all 12 of those things. That may sound like a really long time frame, and in a world where you have to sort of show quick wins for the business, it can be difficult sometimes to sell folks on something like that. But the reality is we've been trying for years to use the cajoling, beat them up approach to get to healthy curves, and we haven't been successful. And so this more incremental approach here. The other thing that's happening here, and it's not shown, is that I've got the filter setting at criticals plus highs. The curve for criticals actually got completely resolved, and then we expanded the scope of their practices to include resolving the highs. And so what you're seeing here is sort of a staged couple of stages sort of merged into one. But yeah, that time frame for getting to healthy is about what you see here.
Yeah, and maybe 1 or 2 more questions on that topic, because how do you approach those conversations with leadership to get that buy-in, so that an organization can say, well, we're going to spend this money, we're going to take up this amount of our engineers' time, we're going to focus this much amount of time of our AppSec team, and we might not know if it's working until 8 months later or a full 1.5 years later. That's, I'm sure, is going to be an uncomfortable way to pitch this. What are some better ways of approaching that, perhaps?
Well, I mean, the reality is that security leadership knows that the way they've been doing it is arguably not that effective and is painful and costly. And the thing that's really woken them up is that development is getting faster and faster with shipping, and they just can't keep up with their old approach. And so they all sort of recognize they got to do something differently. And so pretty much every security leadership is willing to take a risk on a slice of their development group. And once they see that the developers actually love doing it this way and actually are seeking it out as opposed to trying to be forced to do it, then you get this viral adoption going. But you do have to get permission to do a pilot that is 10 teams in the first 6 months and 50 teams in the first year before you can make the case that the security leadership will completely get behind it. And it's key that you make sure you capture the metrics so you can show how effective what you're doing is, so that you can get the case for expanding across your entire enterprise.
Yeah, that makes
sense.
Now,
for smaller organizations that only have 10 teams or 50 teams, yeah. I can launch and transform in a year, essentially, all the way to this.
So one question with that is the buy-in that you're looking for of the security team management or development team management?
Well, I need a little bit of security team management because for a number of reasons. They're the ones who have the budget for the tool licenses, first of all. So I was employed at Comcast by the security leadership, not by the development leadership. But my day-to-day and the folks who really loved what I was doing were all on the engineering side of it. They were frustrated with and sort of used to hiding from and getting away with whatever they can and giving the answer they thought they wanted to hear to security for years. But they also had a desire for engineering excellence. So they didn't want to get us hacked. So they wanted something that would do it. And I was giving that to them. And we did it in a way, I'm a developer, right? I write code every day. I'm the primary author of a dozen open source projects, one of which gets 1 million downloads a month. And so I have instant credibility with those folks. And I didn't do it by saying, hey, you must do this because there's a policy. I basically started with toolsmithing to make it easy for them to do the right thing. I made the path to doing the right thing be the easiest path as well. And this was usually by creating CI plugin tools that wrapped the security tools in a way that made it sort of just a few lines of YAML for a development team to enable this. By automatically giving the feedback the way they want to get feedback, which is typically in the pull request, and have a policy enforcement that is also in the pull request, blocking the merge if it doesn't pass that. And it's not set to a required policy at first. It's set to an inform until they get it down to 0 and it's green for the first time. Then they can switch it to a required blocking sort of mode kind of thing. It empowered them. It gave them this thing. Yeah. So I was working with security leadership at first to get their budget and to get permission to run a pilot like this. But I was doing most of the day-to-day work with the engineering leadership at the organization, to the point where I helped get funding for a DevOps transformation initiative to get teams to do more CI/CD and more automation in the pipeline. Had nothing to do with security, but I was sort of one of the key sponsors, and my engineers contributed greatly to that work.
Oh, very cool. I think one of the things that as we come up here to the end, this is the end of the segment perhaps, but not the end of the journey. Larry, you mentioned a bunch of open source projects. Is there anything that we should be keeping an eye out for over the next couple weeks or months?
Yeah. So the framework I built at Comcast was supported by tooling to essentially track the progress of development teams along this path of improvement. And I'll pull up another screen here in a second to sort of show what I mean there. But of course, a lot of that work was developed at Comcast by Comcast engineers and is not readily available to everyone to use. So I've taken it upon myself to rewrite that tooling. So this is a visualization of the maturity of a 10-team organization on various 11 of the key practices. We only had 11 practices, not 12 when this screenshot was. And this was showing the trending, another cumulative flow diagram of improvement over time for this same organization. So I've taken it upon myself to recode this, and this is just the output screens. All of the coaching screens are essentially baked into an open source project. It's not launched yet, but it's getting close in the next few weeks. If you want to sign up for the beta for that, you can go to transformation.dev today. You can read the FAQ and you can sign up, get on the list to join the beta when we do launch in a few weeks.
Cool. Well, yeah, I like the Death Star looking targeting of the visuals always for anything within security, I suppose. But thank you for that, Larry. This was a fun conversation, and I think we kept it away from the 4-letter words into something more constructive for a shift left success.
Thanks, Mike and John, for having me. It's a pleasure being here, and I agree. I'm glad we stayed away from the 4-letter word.
Well, I want to say thank you to John as well. Thanks everybody in Discord and our listeners. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.